Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Roka Soka Raw episode 4, where we discuss Dragonball is simple, but not bad. See, I've been hearing for a long time and this really pisses me off. This whole notion that just because a story is simple, then that means it's bad. That somehow, the quality of a story depends on how complex it is. Now, there are many reasons that I have to debunk this, but we're just going to go with a few, the more important ones. So, for starters, what at least should matter when it comes to telling a story is how well it's told. And that should be the main determining factor. So basically, execution. I mean, just as an example, we've seen some of the wackiest ideas ever that sound stupid on paper become some of the greatest stories of all time, particularly of the modern age. I mean, stop me if you've heard this one before. Star Wars. Enough said. If you actually listen to the premise of Star Wars without taking into account what happened afterward, it would have sounded absurd, and for a lot of people, even other creatives, it did. But guess what? The movie worked, didn't it? Not only that, but a lot of critics, at least those that take a more honest look at it, know that although it has problems, Star Wars is ultimately considered to be a good story and one of the best stories, at least in movies, ever. Well, at least of popular Hollywood movies. But still, because it's something that it seems, even though it seems simple on the surface, there's a lot of interesting things beneath the surface. And see, that's the key to a great story, is how well it's told. So you can have a simple story that is told very well, and it might have some problems here and there, but it's told very well, so ultimately it's considered a good story. And I also know it's a good story because I've actually watched interviews of professional let's just say story writers and even some story doctors, basically people who know the ins and outs of story but don't actually write that many stories themselves. I mean, they do write some, but they just happen to know the like how stories work. And anyway, what I find from a lot of them is that to them what matters most is execution and not the complexity level of a story. And I feel that by judging a story based on how complex it is, it simply narrows a point of view, and it simply narrows one's enjoyment of a story as well as their ability to critique it, because they'll always be judging it by, oh, where's the complexity? Where's the deep characters and the thought-provoking dialogue? It's like, who cares? Is it told well? Because if so, then it's a good story. If not, then, it shouldn't matter. And, I really hate to bring this up, but, I consider Dragon Ball to be a good story, but it has problems. But on the other hand, I consider Naruto to be a bad story that has problems. And see, before I learned that much about Naruto, I used to think the opposite, that Naruto, like a lot of people said, was a better story than Dragon Ball because it had deeper characters and more interesting plot lines and all that. But come to find out, I watch a lot of YouTubers, particularly a lot of prominent ones and some less prominent ones, who analyze Naruto, whether it be the characters and the story and everything. And the more I learn about Naruto, the more I realize that it's actually a bad story with problems. Now, it's not the worst story out there, and I've come across quite a few bad ones in my day. But it's certainly, of all the mega popular animes, is probably one of the worst. Let's just say there's another that I think is actually worse, but I'm not going to say what it is, but I'm sure you can probably guess. And it has to do with magic. That's all I'm going to say. So, the reason why Dragon Ball is a good story with problems is because despite it having problems, they're not so severe that they completely destroy the story or completely break the story. And also, it has a lot of positives to balance things out. So let me give you an example. So a lot of people cite that Dragon Ball is a bad story because it has all these plot holes. But if you look at a lot of the best stories that were told in movies, at least popular blockbuster movies, such as Star Wars, there are tons of plot holes in there. So as an example, one big plot hole in episode 4 alone is, why is it that Luke Skywalker never had his name changed? I mean, surely if the Empire was looking for him, he would have changed his last name. Also, why would he move to Anakin's home planet and live in the exact same place that Shmi lived, just before she got killed? Obviously, she was sold to Lars. And if that's not enough, there's another plot hole with Obi-Wan. He changed his first name to Ben, but he kept his last name Kenobi. And from what I understand, a lot of people, they knew about him and they knew where he was, so wouldn't the Empire just need to ask around and, find him? Most people don't seem to have that much of an attachment to him, so I doubt they'd care if they gave his location away. And another, I wouldn't say plot hole, but let's just say logic fallacy in episode 5, the one that people say is almost flawless. At the beginning of the movie, they have Han Solo, cutting open the belly of that Tauntaun and putting Luke in there. And it's implied that it took quite a long time for them to rescue Han and Luke. Yet Han was waiting outside the Tauntaun, which to me makes no sense, because if Luke needed to be put in that Tauntaun so that he wouldn't freeze to death, then why would Han not need to be put in that Tauntaun? I mean, he's human too. And that's the thing, I know he's humanoid because, I've obviously, I've watched a lot of Star Wars videos and whatnot, and they pretty much said that he was. And that's just Star Wars. I mean, let's look at other stories. What about Back to the Future? First of all, the entire thing of Back to the Future couldn't really happen because, first of all, if they change, logically, if they changed one thing and they started disappearing, they probably would have disappeared immediately. It wouldn't have been a gradual thing. That seems way too convenient. And the second problem is, if they change the past, then wouldn't Marty have already lived in that past? I mean, it kind of seems like a contrivance there, because it's sort of implied that, once time has changed, it, stays changed, but then you have to go into that concept of, what is it, a time loop? There's just a lot of problems. I don't want to ramble on about that, but there's just a lot of problems in those movies alone. So to say that Dragon Ball, just because it has, plot holes and certain contrivances, is a bad story would pretty much mean that Star Wars, Back to the Future, and many other movies that have certain logical fallacies were bad stories. But guess what? They're not bad stories. And most critics love those movies. So another thing about Dragon Ball that people complain about is that there's a lack of character development, which again I think is nonsense because, first of all, a lot of these people don't even watch the original Dragon Ball or read the manga, and they especially don't watch the, Japanese sub. So when they say there's no character development, they're obviously going after just the DBZ Funimation dub generally. Though there are a few people that try to argue that even despite seeing the Japanese version, that somehow, there's no character development and whatnot. Yet, even when you point to characters like Gohan and Vegeta, Kuririn, Piccolo, etc., then they brush that aside and act like it doesn't matter. It's like, what do you want? I mean, character development is character development, and they are main characters, so your argument's pretty much invalid if you say, oh, none of the characters grow, they all stay the same. No, they don't. Some of them do, but, a lot of the characters that actually matter, they do develop. And if you watch the original Dragon Ball, you have characters like Goku who develop, you have Roshi who develop and who get interesting characterization, Bulma develops, even Yamcha develops for a period of time, as does Kuririn, Tien develops as well. Just, you know, a lot of people who say these things, that I don't think they know what to talk about. And, you know, another thing that people say about Dragon Ball is, oh, it's about punch kicks and energy blasts. Well, if you actually watch the series and read the manga, then you'd know that that's only the case for the last 2 arcs. And even then, there's some level of complexity there. You know, they're sort of undercutting the character development of Gohan in the Cell arc and Vegeta in the Buu arc. And also undercutting the fact that Goku was trying to find a successor. Of course, they don't mention that stuff. You know, I have a feeling that a lot of these people, they're just hating on Dragon Ball for the sake of hating on it. And, you know, it really pisses me off how they just keep insisting with this nonsense as if it's somehow true. I suppose I could make a separate Roka Soka Raw episode pretty much detailing why Naruto is a bad story with problems. Like, I don't want to go into it here because that's a whole new, well, a whole nother issue actually. But yeah, basically I wanted to dispel the whole nonsense that a simple story equals a bad story, and how there are other stories that are considered good, yet not only do they have problems, they're considered to be simple when you actually take a look at the themes and the plot and story and everything, and even the characters. But because it's done so well, because the execution is done so well, it's considered to be a good story. Now, I will say that I will put a story that has both, you know, that is well executed overall, highly entertaining and complex. I will put that above a story that is simple and about as well executed. But the way I see it, the biggest source of a successful story is how well everything fits together and how well everything flows. I mean, no story is perfect. Even the best works of art have some problems in them, whether it be to pacing or characterization, character development, you know, whatever. Anyway, I just wanted to do this episode unloading on all these comments of Dragon Ball being a simple story, therefore it's a bad story. And pretty much, you know, like, if I have to be one of the very few people who say that a simple story can be a good story if it's well executed, then so be it. Anyway, that has been my video. Let me sorry. Let me know what you guys think about Dragon Ball being a simple story and whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. And also let me know whether or not you consider a simple story to be a bad story and it has to be complex in order to be good. Me personally, I don't think it has to be that. It just has to be well executed. Anyway, that's been my video. I'll see you guys later.